I welcome in. I made a video last week about game mechanics. Today I want to talk about environmental mechanics, a similar kind of subject. Let me get a share screen going here. So with environmental mechanics, we played with a lot of different tools for creating terrain. We painted with brushes to raise and lower terrain. We painted on textures and trees. We had the terrain toolbox, a script that procedurally generated a terrain using various algorithms. But we haven't really talked about what we want from our world and how to design it. When you're designing a virtual world, we need to look at the real world, understanding the shadows and colors and textures, clouds, wind, weather, all these tiny details influence the believability of our virtual world. Often it's the things that are not missing that the player doesn't even notice that make the world more believable. These are things like posters on the wall, and dustbins, and scraps of paper, dirt in the corner, scuff marks, chipping paint. These kind of details add to the believability of a game. Of course, you might be doing a cartoon format game, in which case this is not the way you'd go it. But looking at the real world and applying the rules of nature is a good way to plan your world. As we design a map, a good idea is to provide a focal point that acts as the goal location that leads our players on. This can be some kind of dominating feature, a tower, a mountain, a glow in the sky, something that draws the player's eye, attracts them towards it. And also things that assist with the player's orientation. It's really easy in video games to get turned around and end up going in circles and not making any progress. And so if you provide some visual cue as to what direction is what in the game, this can be very helpful. Some people build in compasses. Often in a map design, we need to guide our player to along some path. We can do this by restricting the player's movements. We of course want to make our world seem as open as possible, but clever design will draw a player along a path, restrict their access to the parts of the map that perhaps aren't actually there. Sometimes we have low resolution terrain in the distance that's there just for background, but is not walkable because it doesn't have colliders and it's very low resolution. The path may be just that, a path that you design with texture. But we can also define a path by surrounding it with barriers, with objects that prevent the player from leaving the path. These can be trees, bushes, steep terrain, anything, water, holes in the ground. In the case of a racing game, you might have a track that is defined by guardrails that don't let the cars leave the track. The visual guardrails may be small, but the actual boundary guardrails might be invisible barriers that keep the cars on the track. This idea of distant scenery, like we've made our worlds that are these big squares of terrain, but we get to the edge of it and it looks kind of weird because there's this cliff at the edge of the world. And so often we'll put in low polygon 3D objects that are far away and don't have to have colliders because the player can't access them. We have to be clever about that. We can also use damage and reward systems to guide the player, moving them in a desired direction. We talked about as a game mechanic, avoidance, where as they step off the path, their health starts going down faster. That would keep them on the path. Also, you can use enemies to keep people on the path. Although often we associate enemies with something valuable. You can lead players on with a trail of power pickups that they have to keep getting to in order to keep their health alive. A common error with terrain, with worlds, is to make them too big. You end up walking a lot in this big empty world with not much going on. So it's often better to keep the scale reasonable. And you want to match the player's size scale to the objects in the environment. Our players are 2 meters tall. Things should be comparable in scale. The devil's in the details. If you look at the real world, you'll see that trees distort the terrain on which they sit. Roots make bumps. Grass tends to be taller around trees because it's hard to mow them. There are weeds and rocks. Mountains have tree lines above which trees are smaller or more widely spaced. The ground tends to be rockier. Water often has plants growing along the edge of it, reeds, and the grass tends to be greener around the water. And you can use effects such as bushes and grass to hide abrupt boundaries where one object meets another. So if the trees don't line up well with the ground, with our automatic tree placement tool, plant some grass around them. Now, let me show you an example here of some of these features. This is an old Unity 3 demo game. And unfortunately, it broke in Unity 5, so I don't actually have a copy of this that I can give you, but I do happen to have a compiled version of it. And this actually demonstrates a number of the features that I'd like you to see in here. This is called Boot Camp, and it's unfortunately, it's going to make some noise. So right off the bat, this is where the character manifests. And right away, you can see one of these features, a tall tower off here in the distance. Oh, I can't point at it with the mouse. I can pause the game. Here's a tall tower off in the distance. This actually happens to be where the target of this, the goal of this game is. And another thing to note are these power lines that traverse the game. These power lines actually will lead us to the target as well. With regards to this endless terrain here, if I turn around and go back over here, first of all, I find these fences that are keeping me from going anywhere further, but I can see that low poly, unwalkable terrain off in the distance. So I'm not seeing the edge of the world here. It's there, it's just over the edge of this cliff, but I'm not seeing that. And this wall is not all fence. Over here, I have some unclimbable terrain where the fence disappears. And now we have this big bump in the terrain that is too steep for me to get up. Even if I try the jumping trick, I can't get up. So I'm confined to stay on the walkable terrain, even though far, far away there is this visible but low poly, unwalkable terrain. Now, if I'd started off here at the top of the hill, looking down towards the river, I can see some features that attract me. First of all, there's that tower. As I come around here, there's this bridge. And the bridge is an example of kind of a path that leads you on. You see this bridge and you're tempted to cross it. Here we see examples of some of the detail work where we've got all this paper strewn around. We've got oil cans and boxes and spare tires, and the texture is all rusty and it's not shiny and new. And we're led on by this linear feature that kind of draws us into the game. Here we see an example of just an explicit path. Over here, if I were tempted to try and climb that terrain, I would find that it's too steep. So even though there's no explicit fence there, I'm prevented from crossing that terrain. Traveling on, there's this little shack. Oh, by the way, notice the power lines that are giving me a sense of orientation, a direction that I can follow as I'm lost in the forest here. Here's a place with more of this kind of detail. Of course, we've got a gun that blows things up. And as I kind of follow my wires that orient me, aiming towards this tall tower that is kind of leading me on, texture paths that are leading me on, more detail, scuffed textures, really nice inside detail here. Got posters on the wall that we can try and get close enough to read. Oh, and there we've achieved our goal. The sergeant has told me that I've achieved the goal and I'm ready to move on to the next level of the game. So, so that's an example of some of those features that I described in there.